Well, welcome everyone to the very final session of the Herbert C. Kelman seminar. And we are really delighted to have our two speakers today. And I'm going to introduce them in a minute, but I cannot imagine a better way of finishing off not only the semester, but the year. And I want to just remind everybody that this seminar is co-sponsored by the Program on Negotiation at the Law School and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, also at Harvard. And we will I'd love to just welcome everyone from, I know we usually get people from all over the world, so welcome. And I think you won't be disappointed in this talk that we're presenting today with these two wonderful journalists. And I wanted just to mention that we're going to be probably, since there's two of them and they have a lot to say, we might just have maybe 10 minutes for a Q&A. But if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A function and we will go through them. But the other thing is that we are going to be recording this session. So if you see it and you want to recommend it to your friends, or maybe you'd want to see it again, will be able to do that. If you check back with PON on their website in a few days, you can take a look and see if you click on events, you'll see this one will be posted there. So yeah, so let me introduce these two wonderful journalists we're having today. Yousur Al-Hlou, who is a visual journalist who uses traditional field reporting, visual evidence gathering, and original cinematography to investigate crimes in conflict zones. As a visual journalist, she works for the New York Times. For nearly a decade, she traveled to Syria, Gaza, Ukraine to document human rights abuses and their impact on civilians. Her work with colleagues covered Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and was awarded in 2022 the George Polk Award, in 2024 the DuPont Award, and 2023, last but not least, the Pulitzer Prize for that reporting. And that went to both of these wonderful journalists. So before that, she was a global fellow for the Associated Press in Jerusalem, an associate producer at the Investigative reporting program at the University of California at Berkeley. And currently she's here with us as a Nieman Fellow here at Harvard. And we're delighted to have her. And her colleague, Masha Froliak, um, is together with her colleague, Yousur, also worked for the New York Times. They worked together on this Ukraine project. Their reporting has launched several critical investigations into the likelihood of war crimes on the part of the Russian soldiers committed in Ukraine. In these investigations, they combine traditional reporting with open source methods like forensic analysis of large troves of digital data. They identified the Russian military unit behind the killing of dozens of civilians in the Kyiv suburb of Bucha. In a separate investigation, they exclusively obtained thousands of intercepted calls of Russian soldiers to their families back in Russia. And after months of analysis and verification, they revealed to the public the Russian army is in disarray, in the words of the perpetrators themselves. These investigations, again, those three prizes that I just mentioned, the two of them got them all together. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Yousur and Masha, and I'm so looking forward to your presentation. I'm going to get off here, and I'll come back when you're finished
Thank you, Donna. Should
for
I
a
share
Q&A.
my screen, Ken?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. And if you're on the East Coast here on a very cold day, I'll just share my screen. Okay. Does that look like is that a full screen share? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, everyone. My name is Yousur, and I'll be presenting with Masha. And similar to what Donna said when she generously introduced us, over the last 3 years, Masha and I have been working to uncover potential war crimes committed by Russian soldiers in the war in Ukraine, President Putin's war in Ukraine. And for nearly a decade, I worked at the New York Times, and most recently with a team called Visual Investigations. And what we do on that team is we deconstruct how events unfold minute by minute, to hold powerful people, militaries, politicians accountable for the potential crimes they commit. And it's a very unique it's a unique type of journalism because we blend different tools to do these investigations and produce sort of a very impactful visual type of journalism. And that includes three types of sources. So we do traditional field reporting. So we go into the field, knocking on doors. So what you would expect if you watched a movie about journalists, sort of that door knocking technique is something we do every day. Something you might be unfamiliar with or might not see in a movie is sort of the background work of collecting metadata, visual data, audio data, and analyzing these sort of large troves of collected material. And that could include scraping material and photos and data from social media websites like Facebook and OK and VK in Russia, searching public databases for information that's actually accessible to us, but you need to dig for it to find it. Aggregating and pulling CCTV footage from hard drives all over the cities and towns we're covering. And then also asking for and obtaining exclusive data that we collect from sources in high places. And the third tool we use, or the third component of our journalism, is also original cinematography. So showcasing all of this work to our readers and our viewers in a visual format, we also incorporate cinematography. So these kinds of investigations take months, if not years, and they require us to conduct hundreds, if not sometimes thousands, of interviews with different kinds of people. Those include witnesses and victims of potential war crimes. They include powerful officials, and sometimes and oftentimes the perpetrators themselves. And in order to get sort of these powerful, intimate pieces of data and to collect that in a war zone, and then to also deliver the most impactful story, you really need to know how to negotiate. You need to know how to build relationships with people and sensitive sources. You need to learn how to secure trust. You need to learn how to get people to open their doors and their hearts and to allow you into their homes in the most intimate places. And you need to get them to physically give you a hard drive or a thumb drive or a WhatsApp link with the data that you've requested to do your journalism. So in summary, something Masha and I always say, even before we were connected with this incredible program at the law school, is like, to be the most effective investigative journalist, you really have to be an effective negotiator. And Masha will introduce our work a little bit to help set the scene for what we'll talk through next.
Hi guys, thank you again for joining us today. So I'll highlight a couple of our works. All of these are very technical investigations, but they would not be possible without negotiating access to sources and material. So one of the big investigations we did which took 8 months, was in Bucha, and here we reconstructed what happened in the town of Bucha during the Russian occupation, and we obtained and analyzed terabytes of security footage, of drone footage. We gained access to sensitive sources within the law enforcement agencies, and I obtained classified data. In many instances, our sources actually risked their jobs to handle us this material. And in the end, we were able to identify the military unit responsible for potential war crimes in Bucha and also identify the victims. So on the right, you see the faces and names of the victims killed on this one street. In this investigation, quickly, it was the we managed to obtain 4,000 audio recordings of the intercepted phone calls made by Russian soldiers in Kyiv region. And this story was published on the front page of the New York Times. And it was possible because we were able to obtain access to this sensitive source in the intelligence agency in Ukraine. So again, it's a lot of it is about getting access and to sources and to material. In the next slide, in this investigation, we traced the whereabouts of 46 Ukrainian children who were transferred from Kherson to Crimea, which is in Russian control. And the highlight of this work is that we were able to establish connection with the perpetrators themselves. And we also do documentaries. So in this slide, you see we embedded with the combat medics in Ukraine. And it was during the time when virtually no journalists could even be close to the hospitals. So we were able to build trust with people there to film them so intimately. And I'll give words back to you, sir.
Thanks, Masha. And so we'll take everyone here sort of on a step-by-step. We'll walk you step by step in terms of how we actually prepare and eventually execute the negotiation tactics in order to obtain this material. And really the first step in this process it comes down to preparation. Whether that means preparing for the interview you need to conduct in your field reporting or preparing an approach for a sensitive request of data from officials. And so the first step really is about organizing your mind, your data, and your research so that you're most prepared for when you make a request, whether that's for an interview or for data. And so this is a slide that just shows you how OCD, Masha, and I are in the field. To the left, you'll see sort of the way that we organize each of our recordings. So whenever we do interviews, we have a log of who we've spoken to. That allows us to keep track of people and to be in touch with them in the future, and also just to have a sense of the interviews we've conducted and what information we need to gather in the future. In the middle, you'll see our to-do list. Every day we wake up in Ukraine, we have an agenda that we've set the day before, the night before, that we adjust, and we of course are adaptable to the circumstances of war. But we're pretty keen on keeping this organized and keeping our tasks, committing to these tasks throughout the day. And to the right, you'll see the way that we organize our phone books. Like even the way we save numbers in our phone helps us to stay efficient and organized so that we know who we can resource or, which person might be the right contact when we're on deadline. And so these are really simple things that we do. I mean, obviously there's a much more sophisticated mechanism, but these are, we wanted to showcase even the most minute ways in which we organize and prepare. So depending on who you interview, of course, whether that's someone who's a victim of a crime, an official, or perpetrator, that will demand a specific approach of organization and preparation. So before you even sit down to do the interview or to make a request, you really need to understand that preparation is your superpower for someone to say yes. And so you need to spend time, and we spend time identifying the following. What role will each person play in our story? What perspective do they have to offer? What is their motivation in speaking to us? Why should someone speak to us? And what reservations might they have? Can you think ahead? What might they say no to? Why might they say no? And can you address preemptively some of those concerns? This is also another way that sorry, I didn't show this earlier, but we stay prepared. Every day that we do interviews and work in the field, we also keep a very detailed log of what we've collected. And so that when we get to the point where we're writing, we're ready to go with details. This is another way in which we also organize our material. Anything we collect in the field, we aggregate into spreadsheets. with sort of fact check data, whether that's date of birth or names, and sourcing of that material. So these are just some visual, you might not be working this way if you're a lawyer or a researcher. This might be very particular to the way we do journalism, but we're just trying to give you some ideas of how you might want to organize what you collect to be the most prepared. Sorry, I'm actually realizing I'm not flipping through the correct slide, so I'll move a little bit slowly. But this is what I was referencing in regards to knowing who you're going to talk to. The person on the left is a victim of the shootings on Yablunska Street, the killings of the Russian soldiers committed on Yablunska Street. In the middle, we have Russian soldiers. And to the right, we have Russian perpetrators who removed children from a children's home in Ukraine. And so all of these people require a different approach when we speak to them. What do we do with all this information that I just walked through that we collect? The first thing we do is we make sure we've scraped everything that's potentially accessible to these people, that everything that's available. So if it's a soldier, if we know that we need to make a phone call to a perpetrator or a soldier, First, we stalk them. We try to understand who they are by gathering as much information as possible that's publicly accessible. So that by the time we interview them or need to make a very difficult call, we already know who they are. We have a general sense of what they might say and what their background is. And so these are some of the tools that we use to prepare for the interviews with the perpetrator, for example. We look at their social media profiles. What do they tell us? What clues do they indicate to us about what their politics might be, what military unit they were part of, how they feel and think about the war? We also collect information about victims. So if we're to interview victims, we want to understand, or their families, when or where were they injured or killed? Who are their relatives and surviving family members? And what could they potentially say or deliver information to us about their loved ones who were killed or harmed? And so we collect death certificates, text messages, morgue photos, to prepare to understand who the victim was before we do very sensitive interviews with their family members. When we want to understand a city and a community that we're working in, like Bucha, we try to understand who makes this community, who makes up this community, what is the politics of this community, what has it suffered, what's the context in which we're walking in to do these interviews. And so we often go into community groups and download material and understand the place we're walking into as a character as well. We also use public databases. Public databases help us aggregate information that's accessible to us. For example, when the children were removed from the children's home, it was actually considered classified information to release the names of the children. Turns out the government had actually already released them on this database of missing children. So we were able to understand the population or the children who we were going to be covering and reporting on in order to be prepared to find them later in a Russian database for adoption. And so these are just some examples. You'll also find clues for your preparation process and legislation. If you're looking to build a case against a perpetrator of a potential war crime, what does their legislation say about the legality of what they're committing? In the case of the children, for example, in Russia, removing children is not an illegal act. In fact, it's celebrated by President Putin and his children's commissioner. So using public databases also helps put your story in, or your research in historical context that might be important for the interview later on. We also do deep dives into news sources. So what has the media, besides us, said about the place, the society, or the people who we're following? How can we get a better understanding of who we might interview or who we might request data from through media and news archives? So that's always a good place to look for information as well as you're doing your preparation. And last but not least, especially in the case of Ukraine, Russia, we often do deep dives ahead of interviews and requests. We do deep dives into the social media channels of the people we're interviewing. In the case of Russian officials, they are very active on Telegram. They tend to post their travels, their updates, their meetings, and they always provide visual evidence. And so we look very deeply at at the chronology of events that they post in regards to the topic we're covering. And that's all the material that we aggregate well ahead of making a request or an interview. So preparation really is our biggest commitment. We also spend a lot of time preparing ahead of time questions, especially in the case of sensitive interviews or requests. As you can see on the right, this is a set of questions we prepared ahead of time, specifically in regards to interviewing a prisoner of war. You know, we thought through all the questions we'd need to ask for fact-checking purposes, but we also thought of questions we'd need to ask if the soldier wasn't willing to participate in a certain line of questioning. So we offered ourselves alternatives and different approaches and paths we could take to obtain the material we needed to tell our story most accurately. So organizing questions is as important as organizing and aggregating the research material. And, you know, something that's really important to mention about these questions is really the importance of considering the framing and the approach that you'll take for each of the different kinds of sources you'll approach. You know, we need to really understand what are the political views of each of the people we're interviewing, to get a sense of how to approach them in a way that's sympathetic and understanding to their specific worldview. It doesn't mean we're acknowledging or validating, it doesn't mean we're validating their worldview. It just means we're acknowledging it and try to understand and be curious about why they have that worldview. Or a specific perspective on the potential war crime or the incident. So in making these questions and preparing for the interview or the request, we're really thinking about choosing the words that the other speaker is more comfortable with. And it's not about lying, but or manipulating, but about being strategic and approaching them in a way that's non-threatening. I think I'll pass that on to.
Yeah, I can jump into the next section. By the way, Yousur is the wizard of organization, so you guys should take notes on that. Sorry, I have a fire department here. So once you do reach the stage of securing the interview, strive to turn every no into a yes, and you know, figure out what are the motivating factors for your sources to say yes. How do you convince them to share openly? So there will be different motivations for different sources. A victim, in our case, will have a different motivation from a Ukrainian official. A victim might be motivated to share so that their voices are heard. A Ukrainian official, in some instances in our experience, were motivated because of the bureaucratic reasons in their country. So they were frustrated with the way the official investigation was going, which was kind of slow and messy. So they were motivated to share their data with us so that we could analyze it and then share our analysis with the world. So no matter what the motivation is, it demands time to build trust, and it takes persistence, honestly, to build this relationship. For example, here on this slide, you see our correspondence with one of the sources, and it took us months to get access to very crucial servers that helped us reconstruct the killings of 8 men in Bucha that were part of our investigation. A day before the publication, we decided to, we'll do one last try. We'll message this source again. And a day before the publication again, he messaged us back saying, okay, meet me in this obscure place and I'll hand you the servers. In the end, the photo from those servers was published. It became symbolic, basically, of the war crimes, potential war crimes of the Russian army in Ukraine, and it was published on the homepage of the New York Times. So I'm going to go into some tips of how to get into the door. What helps? It's the Victor slides.
Okay.
And so what helps is to be there in person. On this slide, you see one of our victims and witness sources. So we tried to reach out to him from New York many times, and he just wouldn't pick up the call. Once we made it to Bucha and we just showed up at his door, he was picking cherries, and we sort of started telling him about us, what we're doing, and we said, can we look at your phone? We are collecting data from the occupation time. It's very important for us to get those timestamps of any media. And so he just like, here is my phone. He just handed us his phone, and it turned out that his phone contained really crucial data for us, which helped us identify the times of certain killings we were investigating. In the next slide, so this is investigation that we did in Kherson about the illegal transfer of the Ukrainian kids to Crimea. And probably the only reason we actually got access to data and were able to get interviews with the sources is because we showed up there. And we kept showing up every day, and it was it was still sort of frontline cities, so we were able to establish this connection with nurses of the kids who shared with us the data that helped us. And in the next slides, we actually this summer we traveled to Poland to collect witness account of this one source we are working with. So sometimes you just have to be in person, and it really helps. So in our work in Ukraine, we would often show up at officials' offices and knock on people's doors to introduce ourselves and to tell them what we are doing. And it helps to build this connection. Another tip is, even if there is 1% chance that you will get access to the source or to data, it's worth pursuing it. And sometimes you will deal with very difficult, and probably most of the times you'll deal with difficult people. You just have to remind yourself about the higher mission. And it's not about you need to manage your own emotions if you deal with difficult people, and just be patient and remember that it takes time to build trust. And if you get a no, don't take it personally. Sometimes people are just busy, they're dealing with their personal problems, professional demands, so it's okay, and don't be embarrassed to continue checking in. Basically, don't give up. It's an important tip. And if we can move with the slides about requests. Mm-hmm. So once you are at a position to request data, make it very easy for your sources to provide you with the information that you need. Don't be general, because it will just make them overwhelmed. Be very specific about what you need. So in this case, we were interested in the commanders of the paratrooper unit that was in Bucha during the occupation. So we were very specific about the names, the phone numbers of the people we were interested in. We were referencing certain CCTV cameras, so we would link the geolocations of these cameras. So again, to make it easier for the officials to help us. In the next slides, because there were so many victims in Bucha, there were hundreds of people killed. Once we identified the 36 victims that we were investigating, that's what we requested. And in this photo, you see the folders of the specific case files that we requested. Otherwise, there were like 10 times more of these folders. So we were very specific in our request.
I think, Masha, we should keep moving so forward. So let's do the limitations.
Yeah. So, in your work and knowledge limitations, be humble. You're not a we would always acknowledge that we are not lawyers or aid workers, and we would tell the victim that we might not charge the soldier in the court, but the evidence will be public, and this can create the resonance. Be honest, explain the significance of this contribution, and be direct, address the concerns the source might have, whether it's security concerns, their personal safety matters. And explain how you'll go about conducting your investigation and why they should trust you. And of course, be empathetic. Consider the emotional toll people that speaking to you will have. Mm-hmm. And I think the next stage is the interview techniques, which Yousur will cover.
Just to before we jump into the sort of, so Masha just talked about how we secure the actual requests for data and obtain that data, and also meet with and obtain access to people to interview in person. Just something before I jump into techniques that's really necessary to sort of acknowledge is how much of our identities are actually an asset or a liability in this process. The reality is we talk to people either by phone or face-to-face, and we come with our own personal identities. And I think we think that's something really necessary to actually acknowledge and address and just be aware of. It doesn't prohibit or inhibit you from reporting on or from places that are different from your context and background, but it's important to be aware of them. And to work around them in a way that can help facilitate what you're trying to achieve. So, for example, in Ukraine specifically, there's a sort of this identity factor of sort of the language, right? Do we speak to people in Ukrainian or Russian? And of course, I'm very lucky to work with Masha, who speaks both languages and English. And so she can oscillate and choose the language that's most comfortable for the person that we're interviewing. But that context is something really important to recognize and be aware of, and try to use for your advantage and also for their comfort. And so being aware of your language choices is important in the context of a place like Ukraine. Another example is I'm Syrian American. I don't speak the language. I don't share a culture. However, I do share the fact that my parents come from a place where there is active conflict and where Russia is an active participant in that conflict. So that's actually a way to potentially bond on a human level and relate to people in a way that you can use to sort of establish empathy and trust. That's also authentic. That is a real experience that I share with people in Ukraine. Also, sometimes there's a consideration of the sort of foreign journalist and the local journalists and who might actually have the right to tell someone's story. And I think the beauty of working with someone like Masha is both local and foreign. Masha is from Ukraine, but works and lives in the States. I work in the States, so I parachute into conflict zones. However, I think just having an understanding that we are partly outsiders coming in, just being aware of that is also important, and being incredibly just upfront about our commitment to the conflict or covering the conflict, no matter where we come from, is something that's really important for us. I just wanted to add that. I forgot to mention that earlier. Okay, now back to interview techniques. So we've secured the interview that we need to for our reporting. How do we actually accomplish or get what we need to do, or accomplish what we need to do? So there are many factors to consider when you negotiate access to an interview. Generally, it's figuring out a time to meet. That's actually the hardest part when someone is a very sensitive source or an important official. And so being incredibly prepared and not embarrassed to send repeated reminders with specific pins on a map of where you'll meet is really important. That is actually the reason most interviews fail to happen or are delayed, because of a communication error. So make sure you're communicating the location, the time, and the commitment to that person well ahead of time, and have repeated reminders to do that. It's very simple communication technique that often can make the difference between getting a very important interview and not. However, there are also some times where you need to show up unexpectedly because the source you need to talk to has not been picking up your phone, is busy, like Masha was saying, or is ignoring you for some emotional, political reason. And so sometimes the best approach is actually just to show up. And I would say most of the time that we've done that, we'd already been prepared for what we needed to ask, and it was successful. Or sometimes you'll need to pick up the phone and cold call unexpectedly. So just be aware that while generally the polite thing to do is to set a time and a place, sometimes you might have to also do it in a completely opposite fashion and show up also politely, but without a commitment of time. And for example, there was the municipal sort of director of Bucha is very busy, and he was willing to participate in our project and in our reporting, but could never find a time to meet. And so we just showed up at the municipal building and tagged along and followed him that way. So you'll have to try different techniques to secure the actual interview meeting. In terms of how Masha and I share the interview burden, in a way, it helps to have two people. And that's because sometimes you need to play good cop, bad cop, not in a manipulative way, but in a way that just might work well for the person in front of you in that moment, depending on their emotional state or sort of the energy they might want to receive that day. And so offering a sort of having two people who can connect with the person being interviewed sometimes is very helpful. Sometimes one person is enough, and sometimes Masha will go in by herself, and that just and I'll sort of review the notes afterwards. So being flexible with with sort of the team is important. It's also important to be wearing two hats and recognizing that we wear two hats all the time, Masha and I. We are both humans and reporters, and they're not mutually exclusive, but sometimes they demand different things in the interview. And so sometimes you need to be prepared to put your pen down and just absorb the setting, absorb the person you're with without an agenda. Like obviously at the end of the day, when Masha and I approach someone, we're seeking an interview, seeking data. Sometimes people don't have time, and it's it's vegetable growing season, or someone is in the middle of yoga, or someone needs being flexible to put our pen down is the most important lesson we've learned, and ultimately always lands us the interview, but maybe not at the time we expected. So having that flexibility of being human first is very important. And just sort of knowing how to code switch and have the appropriate persona at the right time is very important. So while you should be prepared, you should have done the homework, and you should have an agenda, and you should have set the meeting, be prepared to have your expectations of what that looks like challenged and changed. I'll just go back here. So some of the interview tips, and we don't have a slide for this, so I'll just stay on number 6 for now. But some of the interview tips for those of you asking or interested is, a lot of it you learn on the job, on demand, but we sort of wrote a list of a few things that we thought could be helpful. And I'll just kind of go through them pretty quickly. Depending on the nature of the interview and who you're speaking to and their emotional state when you arrive to the interview, you'll need to determine if this is a more formal interview or a more casual interview. And you'll also need to determine if it's a conversation you want to have on the record or off the record, or on background. So on background means the information can be used, but the source's name can't be referenced. And off the record means nothing this person says and their name can't be used. So sometimes you establish that ahead of time, and sometimes you adapt to the circumstances. So again, a lot of that is a feeling. Like someone could have agreed to a meeting, but on that day is just not in the mood, or doesn't have, maybe is drunk even, or it's inappropriate to take advantage of someone when they're not in the right don't have the capacity. And so you need to be willing to adjust. And sometimes being formal is the right approach with certain people. And sometimes just being sort of a more casual interview is the right tone. Also, come prepared with your questions, but make sure those questions are open-ended. It's very tempting to ask yes or no questions, and sometimes that's important and strategic. However, most of the time you want to be super open-ended and flexible, and sort of flexible to receive any kind of response they might want to give you, and then to be curious from there. And you want to think of reframing questions that are inherently yes or no, just to give people the opportunity to give you more information. So if you ask someone, is your favorite color red? It's very different than what is your favorite color? You'll get a lot more out of an open-ended question. Also, don't make assumptions about how you think people will feel. Just because we're interviewing someone in Russia doesn't automatically mean that they hold a certain perspective on the war. Be willing to be curious. Same thing with soldiers. Just because a soldier was sent into the field or opted to join the military doesn't mean that they won't have a nuanced opinion about the war. So be about the conflict. So be willing to be also open-minded about what you might hear from the person you're interviewing. And sometimes asking short follow-up questions is as important as an open-ended question. So if someone gives you a response, whether it's long or short, follow-ups that are very brief are very important. Like, tell me more. Why? Really? How? So again, we prepare long questions, but we're also keeping these shorter ones in mind to prompt someone just to continue sharing information. You also need to know when to push forward and pull back. So sometimes you're on a roll and you want to keep getting to the point you're trying to make. Sometimes the best thing is actually to pull back and come back to the question you actually are trying to get at if the person isn't engaging in the way you want. So understanding that dance is really important. Because it might feel like you need to get the answer now and double down, or you might lose the opportunity. But oftentimes, diverting, calming the tone down, and returning to the point might be more effective. And you can always take notes, right? We've prepared our questions. So if there's something that hasn't been answered, we can always return to it. So taking notes and sort of doing this live fact checking as you go is an important technique. Sometimes you might want to divert them or throw them completely off course in a friendly way, of course, in a gentle way. But, if someone if the energy that you want in the room isn't where you want it to be, sort of asking a question to introduce some levity, or even just being curious about something in the room to distract is also a good strategy. And then coming back to the important, serious question later can help. The most important thing we've learned is embracing awkward silences. We always come in with an agenda and a need. And that makes a lot of sense. We've prepared for this moment and we have this request, or we have these questions we need to ask. But the more you fill that space, the less you allow for the other person to fill it for you in a way that's authentic, or maybe even more raw than you'd expect. And so don't feel pressured to fill in the space. If you ask a question, feel free, let that silence linger. Don't interrupt the person before they finish their thought, and allow a very awkward length of time to pass before you ask the next one. It doesn't mean that there aren't times where you want to engage a bit quicker, but that silence is key. If they're crying or having a very emotional response to a question, try not to interrupt that or prompt them in any way. Like, that is an authentic moment and they might need to process it. However, don't forget to ask them why they feel that way, or why they are crying or feeling quite emotional in that moment of time. So make sure to be empathetic, sympathetic, but also curious about what's prompting that response. And in that moment, reassure them that if they want to end the interview, pause it, leave the conversation, that's well within their right, and they have the agency to do that. Sometimes letting people sit in their emotions is actually helpful for them. Sometimes people need to relieve or an emotion they've been suppressing. So you'll need to feel out when it's appropriate to continue the conversation, when someone is emotional, and when to pause. Sometimes you'll also need to let people guide you to where you want to go. You don't always want to reveal all the information you've collected about someone. You want to let them teach you who they are and what their motivations are. And sometimes if you show also your cards too soon, you're not giving them an opportunity to be their most authentic self, because it appears like you're coming with an agenda. Whereas actually you should be arriving at their door with curiosity first. So don't always, we talked about scraping, collecting data, knowing someone well ahead of the interview, but that's more for strategic purposes, and it doesn't always need to play out that way during the interview. And sometimes you actually want to act completely clueless. Like, you might have spent 3 months investigating this person, this perpetrator, and you might know the names of all their cousins and children, but actually you want to enter the room as though you don't know anything, so that they can fill in the necessary blanks for you and you're not making any assumptions. So sometimes we get embarrassed to act clueless or play dumb or not have the answer to everything, but that is actually the patient strategy is the most successful strategy. And asking someone to explain something to you is not a point of embarrassment. It's a very strong and powerful technique, in my opinion. Can you explain that to me? I don't understand. Can you elaborate? Can you repeat that? Is that what you really meant? That's going to produce a lot more nuance and interesting information than if you sort of go into a situation as though you know everything already. Sometimes you want to play devil's advocate and assume that sometimes if you're not getting what you need, you can throw in something that's leading to see how they'll respond. So if the soldier doesn't want to confirm that he was in Bucha, you can say, but you were in Bucha, right? So sometimes, again, it's a dance. Like, when do you hold the information and when do you reveal it depends on the mood of the interview and if you're getting what you need to get. And the most important thing, and the last thing I'll say, is that it is obligatory for any journalist to ethically center the discussion in objectivity, neutrality, balance, even when you're speaking to a perpetrator of a potential war crime, even if it's the most difficult interview you must do for your story. You have to take seriously the perpetrator's right to reply, their context. You need to approach it with as much objectivity. The same sort of willingness to listen to a victim should be offered to a soldier. And sort of validating their that's very important, at least in the work that we do. Okay, back to Masha.
And so after the interview, try to maintain the momentum, follow up with your source immediately, routinely check in, inquire about any updates with their story, explain how they'll appear in your publication, share updates on your ends with them, and once we published our investigations, we would always reach out to our sources, share the link, and then also share the impact and any resonance of the work. So we would continue keeping in touch. I don't know do we have time to go over the framing section?
How are we on time, Donna?
We have about 3 minutes left.
Okay.
Because we really want to get to some of the questions. There's some really good questions.
So maybe we can stop there and just take questions.
Well, and maybe there's just one closing thing you want to say about framing?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. Something. Yeah, that's definitely a great idea. Something we wanted to say is, we talked a lot about preparation, securing the data, securing the interviewing techniques, and what to do after the interview. Something that we often, as the journalists and reporters of a story, something we also have to consider and negotiate in this case is with our editors, is the framing of the narrative, right? So we've done all this reporting, we've interviewed victims, officials, perpetrators. How do we frame the story in a way that's objective in tone? And these are difficult decisions that have to be made back in New York or in editing rooms with editors, sort of the crafting of what we want to say and how we want to say it, which is in its own way a form of negotiation. And so a question that's always on our mind as the reporters of the story is, how can we balance what we've reported with sort of objectivity and openness, and how might someone we've interviewed see their story or their role in the war, and does it align with the way we've reported it? And so while we draw hypotheses, we have hypotheses that we're reporting in the field during the reporting process. These are hypotheses that we're exploring. We never walk into an interview or walk into an editing room back in New York with sort of the headline already written. We're very much open-minded to where our reporting will lead and what the reporting tells us. At the same time, we're also curating and obtaining opinions from professionals in different fields, like the legal field, about what it all means, right? So we can say that we've reported that Russian officials have taken children from a Ukrainian children's home, but what is the legal implication of that? Ultimately, Masha and I are reporters, and so we rely on, for example, legal experts to help us frame the narrative and help us frame the headline, and sort of to describe what we've reported in the most accurate terms that feels fair for everyone who we worked with to tell the story. So how do we accurately identify the groups and institutions to blame? Is it a singular blame of an individual, or is it a joint contribution? Did two parties participate? How do you address all the context and the factors that contributed to the potential war crime, both on the Ukrainian side and the Russian side? And so all of that requires balance and negotiation. Is it, ultimately what I think we can end on is, like, for us, what drives us in the sort of framing process at the end of all this reporting is we really are most interested in doing stories that are victim from the perspective, what it was like to experience this as a victim, and what does the perpetrator, and also how is it like to experience this from the perpetrator side, and can we offer a balance in exposing both of those perspectives accurately. And that negotiating the space on the page for victim-led reporting versus perpetrator-led reporting, there's no actual answer for how to do it right. The best you can do is do the reporting, have an open mind, and present the information as factually as possible, and let audiences determine what they believe what they believe the takeaway is.
Well, thank you both. That was remarkable. I can't even begin to imagine what that process that you've described so beautifully is like in the immediate experience of trying to get these interviews and stuff. It's just amazing what you've accomplished. No wonder you got the Pulitzer Prize, though. It's fantastic. A lot of that you've addressed some of these questions already, because people were concerned about neutrality. And this one, for example, how do you ensure that your interpretation of a perpetrator's motive or character isn't influenced by subtle personal biases when you're working primarily with public or limited information? And another one in that same sort of vein is when your reporting focuses on the priorities of one country, what value do you see in examining the counter perspective of or rival motivations to ensure the story remains balanced?
Masha, do you want to take on the first one? I think it's because...
Yeah, I think in our reporting, Yousur and I would really go out of our way to reach out to the other side. So even though we were reporting in Ukraine, but we would do everything and anything possible to find the contact information of the perpetrators, or the people who we thought were involved in some illegal activity or crime, a Russian official. And in many cases, we actually spoke, for the investigation into the military units involved in the killings in Bucha. We spoke to numerous soldiers and their relatives. For the Ukrainian kid story, we were able to speak to Russian officials and to get them to speak to us on record. So it's very important to cover the other sides. And for us, it was really always an important sort of goal to present the other side's sort of story. In terms of the neutrality, we really work in a way where we follow where the evidence leads us, and we always also challenge our own thinking and our own sort of understanding of the events. So, for example, with the transfer of the Ukrainian kids investigation, there was already a very strong narrative about what happens in general with the kids' deportations. By the time we were working on our investigation, everybody was talking about 19,000 children were illegally deported. And this is the official statistics that Ukrainian government was providing. So we actually spent a lot of time trying to find out where this data is coming from. And so we were challenging the Ukrainian government's data as much as we would challenge Russian government. So it's important to have this neutrality.
Okay.
If Yousur wants to add
I would just say, and like Masha said, I mean, ultimately our physicality, we are physically reporting from Ukraine. I would argue, and I guess I'd need to fact check this with Masha, but that we'd spend as much time back in New York reporting from and on the Russian perspective as we do in the field in Ukraine reporting on the Ukrainian perspective, right? It is an equivalent for us reporting necessity. In fact, a lot of times we actually the most criticism we've received, which is all valid and we take it in stride, and it's absolutely important to engage in these types of conversations, but we typically get criticism from Ukrainian journalists for including Russian perspectives in our stories. In the case of the investigation into the killing of civilians in Bucha, we identified over 20 soldiers who were involved in part of a unit that was responsible for those killings. And we spoke to every single, in each of the 22 cases, we either spoke to the soldier themselves or a living family member. And attempted repeatedly to be in touch with them. It wasn't about one interview, like a gotcha moment. It was about truly understanding what their motivations were, what the backlash was for them when they returned home. There are some soldiers who are actually prisoners of war in Ukraine now, who were part of the Bucha campaign, who we spoke to, who were attempting to flee Russia before being brought back into Ukraine to fight. All to say their stories, lines, their motivations are as important for us to absorb and contextualize as anyone else in our stories. Like Masha said, we if we didn't hear, I'll stop there.
We are also transparent in our methodologies. So under each investigation, we would describe how exactly we came to, like, what was our analysis, what sources what data we were using to come to this conclusion.
Yeah. All right.
Is that an answer, or is there anything else you'd like to sort of for us to?
No, that's perfectly fine. I mean, you did a great job responding, I think. And you also mentioned several things during your talk about how to maintain the neutrality as well. But this is an interesting question, I think. How do you recognize when it's time to pause or stop an interview?
Oh, that's very hard. I'll synthesize it in one word: vibes. For all of those who are millennial or younger, it really is about the mood of the room or the phone call. There is no definitive answer for how to know. Part of it, it's a feeling based on experience. There are multiple risks if you end an interview too early. But sometimes you have to take that risk, but being aware of the risks is important. If that person is highly suspicious and sometimes you need to it's a long-term approach and it takes time and consistency. You need to be willing to pull out of an interview so that they don't feel overwhelmed, and trust that that there's an open door left, and that if you actually give them the time and space to process our first meeting, our first phone call, to see that we're normal human beings with a good intention and agenda. So sometimes that you need to leave the person wanting more, and so you have to make a very difficult decision actually to leave in order to have a long-term relationship. Sometimes ending the interview is strategic because the other person starts to ask you questions that you are not prepared to answer, or wants an exchange, a bribe, for example, and you want to end an opportunity for them to ask that of you in any way. You want to eliminate any possibility for something to appear transactional. Yeah. And so sometimes stopping is smart because it prevents you from having to negotiate anything that is unethical. Sometimes stopping the
You
interview.
know, I'm sorry, Yousur, but we're going to have to stop because Nicole Bryant, the managing director of PON, is going to come on just for a few seconds and describe some upcoming events. But let me just say in closing here that, as a psychologist, I can hear not only in your explanations profound negotiation strategies, but you also have deep, deep insight into the human psyche. And I just wanted to acknowledge that because it's so touching to me personally, and I think probably to many of our observers here too. All right, thank you. And Nicole, it's up to you now. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Donna. And let me just say, I hope I'm not the reason we have to stop. Time is the reason that we have to stop. However, in this case, embodying time. Masha and you, sir, I got to see you when you were here at the law school about a month ago, and this was just as extraordinary. Thank you so much for sharing and really incredible lessons for those of us who study negotiation also. A lot about yesable propositions and in contexts that, I and many of our viewers will not find themselves in, but I really appreciate that you're echoing a lot of what we study and research here at the Program on Negotiation. And thank you, of course, to my friend Donna for all of her good work moderating and all of the work we do together throughout the year, as well as to the wonderful PON event staff, Laura Sampietro, Kenneth Russell, Louise Reyes, Diane Long, on with us today. I'm so grateful for everything you did to make this session possible. A word as we close out 2025 for PON live events. We have our next two events. I'm sure there will be some in the interim between the first and the second, but in any case, our next event will be January 27th with Professor David Hoffman, PON affiliate faculty member and a lecturer on law here at Harvard Law School, previewing his new book. We will later in the semester also have Professor Julia Minson of the Kennedy School also on for a book talk, and we continue to update all of our events on our website. If you want to share this event with a friend or would like to review, it will be live on the P1 website probably by the end of this week. Thank you to the over 100 people who tuned in at peak time. We are so grateful for our community, and we're wishing everyone a wonderful holiday season for those who are celebrating, and a very peaceful start to the new year. Thank you very much to our guests, and see you all very soon.